Tonight, we ask a question we sincerely hope you'll never have to answer. Would you betray your friends to save your family? This was the dilemma facing Daniel Boone in the summer of 1778, and his answer would result in one of the most legendary battles in American history. Tonight, join History at the OK Corral for the terrifying, true story of the Siege of Boonesborough.
Boonesborough, Kentucky, September 13, 1778. In the dim light of dawn, legendary frontiersman Daniel Boone crouches behind the wooden walls of the frontier fort and listens closely for any sign of movement coming from outside. Somewhere out there, in the dark, mist-covered forests, he knows that hundreds of Shawnee warriors are lying in wait. Boone and the 50 men around him with their rifles at the ready know an attack is coming, but they do not know when. Then, suddenly, the tree line explodes in a fireball. At the same instant, bullets slam into the timbered walls of the fort, sending splinters flying into the faces of several men. Seconds later, war cries abound from the forest, and another volley slams into the fort walls, this time from the trees to the south of them. And then another from the west. The Shawnee have returned, and it seems that they are everywhere, attacking from 3 sides at once. Boone and his companions now fire their rifles, unleashing a volley of their own into the Shawnee.
The fight is now on, and for Boone and the other men inside the fort, the stakes are clear. It is victory or death. Because this is not a random attack by the Shawnee. Boone personally knows many of the warriors now swarming around the walls of the fort. Only months earlier, the Shawnee had considered him to be one of their own. In fact, their leader, a Shawnee chief named Blackfish, had considered Boone to be his adopted son. Now, they seek to kill him. Adding to Boone's troubles, many of his countrymen now fighting beside him have suspected for weeks that he may in fact be a spy for the Shawnee. Daniel Boone is a man caught in a very complex situation, but only he knows the truth of how he came to be here. It had only been last winter when he had led 30 men to the Blue Licks, a saline spring that runs off the Licks River in northern Kentucky, so that they could gather and then boil down the salty water. This would produce the salt they would need to cure their meat. A veteran of the frontier, Boone was well aware of the lurking dangers, from flooding rivers, to snakes, to bears and panthers, to hostile native tribes. But Boone and the other men had seen fit to make the treacherous journey for 3 reasons. 1. The intermittent fighting between themselves and the Shawnee had largely halted, as it often did during the winter. 2. Salt was an absolute necessity, and procuring it was very nearly a life-and-death matter for anyone living on the frontier. And 3. Boone and his American cohorts believed it to be land that they had rightfully purchased 3 years prior. And, in point of fact, they had, when Richard Henderson had purchased a tract of roughly 200,000 acres on the Ohio River with the signing of the Treaty of Sycamore Shoals in March of 1775. But there was a significant problem with Henderson's land deal. He had purchased the land from the Cherokee tribe, and, unfortunately for Henderson, the Cherokee had little to no jurisdiction in this area. This area, in fact, rightfully belonged to the Shawnee, and they viewed any American settlers as intruders on their land, deserving of death. This sentiment drove the Shawnee to an unlikely partnership, one that spawned from the unfolding American Revolution taking place several hundred miles to the east. British agents from Fort Detroit had struck deals with the Shawnee, agreeing to arm them in order to stop any westward expansion by American settlers. The British had signed a package deal of sorts, uniting the Shawnee with the Wyandot, the Mingo, and the Delaware tribes in order to wage an unremitting war against any and all American intruders, With their newfound support and newly gotten rifles, the Shawnee intended to reclaim their rightful lands once and for all.
Before Boone and his men had even reached the Blue Licks area, Shawnee scouts were already closely following them. When the Americans had finally reached the salty waters, Boone had decided to venture out hunting in search of fresh meat. He had traveled only a few miles away from camp when he found himself suddenly surrounded by roughly 100 Shawnee warriors under the command of Chief Blackfish. The Shawnee were well aware of who Daniel Boone was, as his legend on the frontier had spread even to the native tribes. Boone was able to skillfully leverage his reputation and negotiate not only for his life, but the lives of his men. He managed to convince the Shawnee that he and his men were worth more to them as prisoners than as slain enemies.
Chief Blackfish had spared Boone's life, but he demanded that Boone return to the Shawnee's camp and that he order his men to lay down their arms and surrender themselves to the Shawnee. The chief had insisted that if his demands were complied with, Boone and his comrades would remain unharmed. And to be sure, he had honored his word, as every member of the captured party was in fact treated humanely, at least by frontier standards. Still, the 28 captured men were forced to march roughly 160 miles to a large Shawnee village known as Chillicothe, located across the Ohio River. Throughout the lengthy march, Boone had impressed the Shawnee and his fellow captors with his endurance and stoicism. Boone's steadfastness and courage had so impressed the Shawnee that when they arrived at the village, he and his men were soon treated as adopted members of the tribe. Over the following few months, all of them would be treated humanely, a far preferable option to the torture killings that were often wrought upon captured men. Within months, most of the Kentuckians would be traded to other tribes or to the British to use as hostages in bargaining with the Americans. But Boone had so impressed Chief Blackfish that the old war chief had adopted him as his own son, perhaps as a replacement for a son he had lost in battle. Boone was given the Shawnee name of Sheltowee, or Big Turtle. His head was shaved except for a small lock on top of his scalp, and he wore traditional Shawnee clothing including buckskin breeches, a thin shirt, and leather moccasins. He learned the Shawnee language and took part in hunting and scouting parties, valued for his skills and bravery. Boone even joined a Shawnee delegation who traveled to British-held Fort Detroit, where British officer Henry Hamilton attempted to bargain for Boone's release. But the Shawnee had resolutely refused any offer, as they now regarded Boone as one of their own. Throughout this time, in the spring of 1778, Boone had found himself increasingly torn between two worlds. On one hand, he was indeed a Kentucky settler, with a wife and children waiting for him back at the Boonesborough fort, all of whom were no doubt grieving his absence and constantly worried about his safety. On the other hand, he now found himself identifying more with the Shawnee people and with Chief Blackfish. The chief and his people had come to depend on Boone as well, as his skills as a tracker, hunter, and negotiator had made him an invaluable member of their village. They also possessed a true sense of love and fidelity for the frontiersman, one he felt more and more attached to. But soon, the pull of his loyalty to his family back in Boonesborough began to weigh more and more heavily on Boone. Then, one day during June of 1778, word reached Blackfish's village that the warriors from several Shawnee villages were amassing their forces for an all-out assault on Boonesborough. This was the final straw for Boone. Though he feigned loyalty to the Shawnee for a few weeks, he soon slipped away while out on a hunting party with other Shawnee. He made his way on foot back to Boonesborough, only to be met with bad news and an icy greeting. Boone's entire family, save for his beloved daughter Jemima, had left the settlement and retreated east to stay with family. Several of the men who he had been captured with had already made their way back to Boonesborough and reported that Boone was now living with the Shawnee. Reports from merchants and traders who had passed through the fort insisted that Boone was spotted in full Shawnee dress, even with his hair cut into their traditional style. This soon drew suspicions from a number of the settlers, and when Boone returned, many greeted him tacitly, leaving Boone confused and hurt. But Boone's loyalties were soon made clear when he warned his countrymen of the approaching Shawnee attack. This was not merely a raid for prisoners or supplies, he warned them, but an attempt at all-out annihilation. Within hours of his return, the fort was abuzz with men, women, and children working furiously to prepare the fort for the oncoming attack. As much water as could be carried was gathered from the nearby creek, one bucket at a time. Weapons were cleaned, doors reinforced, and ammunition stockpiled at strategic points along the wall. Boone's brother, Squire Boone, a noted local inventor, employed several ingenious measures to fortify the men's fighting positions. He cut angles into the insides of the firing ports, allowing the men inside to maneuver themselves with minimal exposure to enemy fire coming from outside. He designed a water supply system made of dugout logs which could supply the men at the walls with a continuous supply of water. He also designed a primitive frontier cannon made of hollowed-out logs strapped together with iron rings. These arduous preparations continue for months, and as Boone and the others worked, they all knew that somewhere, out in the dark, foreboding forest, the Shawnee were making preparations of their own, and soon they would make their attack. Finally, on September 7th, at around midday, a party of Shawnee, roughly 400 to 600 strong, arrived at the fort. They were led by Chief Blackfish and flying a British flag. For 2 months now, everyone inside the fort had worried about this day, dreading the sight of belligerent warriors crashing through the tree line, barreling towards them with hellish war cries. And perhaps none among them had worried so much as Daniel Boone. But Blackfish, his adopted father, had appeared with an agreeable look on his face and beckoned to them with overtures of peace. Many inside the fort felt a rush of relief, but Boone and the other more experienced frontiersmen remained dubious. Still, they had little choice but to at least try to negotiate for a peaceable outcome. Boone and 8 to 9 other men soon ventured out of the gates and met Chief Blackfish and his men in a small clearing just outside the fort. The meeting with his former friends and adopted father at first had been peaceable, but before long, after a signal from Blackfish, the warriors had attempted to seize Boone and his comrades in order to hold them hostage. But Boone and the others had managed to slip free and flee back into the relative safety of the fort. This had marked the beginning of 5 long days of what amounted to a siege, with the Shawnees surrounding the fort and Boone and the Kentuckians trapped inside. On the second day of the siege, continuous sniper fire between the two parties was exchanged. On the third day, the Shawnee had attempted to set fire to the fort, but Squire Boone's water supply system, along with bucket lines of women and children, along with intermittent rains, had managed to quell the flames. On day 4, the Shawnee had begun digging a tunnel from the riverbank to the fort in hopes of digging under the fort's walls, lighting a fire, and causing the walls to eventually collapse. On the 5th day, firing on both sides continued, resulting in a Shawnee being killed near the tunnel entrance, lowering their morale and causing them to abandon the tunnel. On day 7, the Shawnee have again massed their forces to attack the fort, but this time, Chief Blackfish has ordered a coordinated attack, and as Boone and the men inside the fort now continuously fire and reload, they must defend 3 sides of the fort all at once, while outnumbered roughly 20-1.
The fighting continues like this for a number of hours until mid-morning, when the Shawnee unleash the next phase of their attack. Now, warriors begin rolling bundles of burning brush up against the palisade walls and throwing torches into the fort.
A section of the palisade walls does indeed catch fire, but it is quickly put out due to the skillful work of Squire Boone. But now, the battlefield outside the walls is covered in a thick cloud of smoke. This obscures the Shawnee's movements, and dozens of warriors are able to move into position only a few yards away from the fort's walls.
Now, they hammer the compound with bullets and arrows, attempting to shoot between the thin slits between the logs that make up the walls of the fort. The Kentuckians are left to aim at mere shadows and flashes, all obscured by the heavy smoke. For hour after hour, this vicious exchange continues, with the women and children of the fort being employed to melt and pour lead for ammunition and to assist in reloading the weapons, while the men focus on firing upon the Shawnee. For his part, Chief Blackfish is able to rotate new warriors in every few hours, allowing his men to get at least some measure of rest during the fighting. But for Daniel Boone and the other settlers inside the fort, there is no such luxury. Just before noon, a number of warriors are nearly able to breach the southern wall, leaving Daniel Boone, Squire Boone, and others firing at point-blank range, only narrowly avoiding being overrun when the Shawnee at the wall finally fall back after 30 minutes of close combat, leaving several of their comrades dead on the ground. But the Shawnee attack has only begun. Throughout the afternoon, the firing continues, with wave after wave of Shawnee pouring fire into the fort, and the defenders becoming more and more exhausted. Many within Boonesborough can now barely breathe, as thick layers of smoke seem to settle within the walls, causing many to choke and to cough. But still, the battle carries on, with the Shawnee seeming more resolved than ever to destroy the Kentuckians once and for all. Through it all, Daniel Boone maintains an air of calm and confidence, encouraging the men and assuring the women and children. If nothing else, any lingering questions of Boone's loyalty have now been put to rest. Finally, just as the sun begins to set, Chief Blackfish orders one final, massive charge targeting the weakened southern wall. Again, hordes of Shawnee warriors pour out of the woods, and again, they throw bundles of burning brush and torches against the fort's walls. More volleys of bullets and arrows pour into the fort, and the defenders again man their stations at the portholes and resume firing. This time, though, they are finally able to inflict enough losses to seemingly break the Shawnee's morale. The warriors soon mount a retreat, melting into the tree line and disappearing from sight. The fields that separate the fort from the trees are now strewn with torches, weapons, trampled crops, dead livestock, and the bodies of more than 36 Shawnee warriors. Many inside the fort feel that the fight has finally been won. But Daniel Boone knows better. He orders double sentries posted on each wall, and for the rest of his men, most of whom have been fighting for almost 36 straight hours, to get some rest. The Shawnee, he assures them, will return. And the next day, Boone is proven correct, as Chief Blackfish, having abandoned the notion of a head-on assault, has ordered his warriors to resume tunneling underneath the fort. This time, though, the settlers dig their own counter-tunnel, flooding the path of the Shawnee's tunnel and thwarting their hopes of any subterranean assault. The day after this, on September 15th, the 9th day of the siege, the Shawnee actually resume their tactics of making a charge upon the weakened southern wall of the fort. Close quarters fighting again ensues, but again, the Shawnee are rebuffed. However, despite another small victory, exhaustion is beginning to take hold over all of those inside the fort. Finally, on the day after this, the 10th day of the siege, it seems that Shawnee activity has almost halted. Scouts sent into the woods return to report that the Shawnee have begun to move their wounded north of the Ohio River. It seems that Blackfish has concluded that he will need artillery in order to properly assault Boonesborough, and that he can take no more casualties at this point. Finally, after a restless, unsure night, Boone allows the gates of the fort to be opened. The Shawnee are gone. For now.
The final estimates hold that 37 Shawnee have perished, along with 2 of the settlers. But under Daniel Boone's leadership, the Kentuckians have managed to survive the impossible. After the battle, the Shawnee and Chief Blackfish would find themselves momentarily disoriented. However, Blackfish would soon resume his attacks on the Americans, determined to drive back their incursion at any cost. In 1779, the year after the siege of Boonesborough, he would perish in an assault on Fort Randolph, a loss his people would never truly recover from. But even after the loss of Blackfish, the fight between the Shawnee and the Kentuckians is not over. Daniel Boone as well would continue to face a number of challenges in the coming year, even being court-martialed by the Virginia militia in 1778 under charges that he had surrendered his party at the Blue Licks too easily, and that he had conspired with the Shawnee. Boone, however, resolutely defended himself against these charges and was quickly acquitted of all of them. But Daniel Boone's war with the Shawnee had only just begun. The coming years will see countless engagements with the tribe, as well as a number of devastating personal losses that will change the course of his life forever. But the many tales of the legendary frontier war between Daniel Boone and the Shawnee are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Thank you again for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. If you liked this story, be sure to click on one of the videos on your screen now to watch more. Also, if you'd like to learn more about Old West history, be sure to sign up for the HOKC newsletter. Link is in the description below. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.